It is the 12th of January, 1945, and along a 250-mile stretch of the Vistula River in occupied Poland, the earth itself seems to be tearing open. At 4 in the morning, Soviet artillery begins a bombardment so dense that German officers watching from forward positions will later struggle to describe it in anything but the crudest terms. A wall of fire, a horizon on fire, the sky itself burning. Within hours, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers backed by over 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns begin pouring across a front that German intelligence had estimated would take weeks to break. It takes days. In some sectors, it takes hours. German divisions that had been rebuilt, restocked, and reinforced through the autumn of 1944 simply cease to exist as coherent formations before the week is out. Not because the men inside them lacked courage, but because there was almost nothing left to fight with. Fuel tanks stand dry. Replacement drafts arrive at the front carrying rifles they were issued 3 days earlier and have never fired. Divisional commanders radio requests for reinforcement to a high command that has no reinforcements left to send. By the end of January, Soviet spearheads have advanced over 300 miles, from the Vistula almost to the Oder, deep into what had until recently been considered the German heartland. It is one of the fastest large-scale military collapses in modern history, and it happens to an army that, barely 3 years earlier, had stood at the gates of Moscow and driven British and American forces into a humiliating retreat at Dunkirk. This was not the same army. By January 1945, the force wearing German uniforms bore only a nominal resemblance to the one that had swept across Poland in 1939 or France in 1940. It was an army hollowed out from within, sustained increasingly by improvisation, propaganda, and sheer bureaucratic inertia, rather than by any genuine capacity to fight a modern industrial war. What happened to that army in its final months is not a simple story of a nation running out of soldiers, though manpower did run desperately short. Nor is it simply a story of running out of fuel, tanks, or ammunition, though all of that happened too, and happened with brutal speed. It is a story of an entire military and industrial system collapsing in on itself, of a command structure that made the collapse worse through choices that had nothing to do with battlefield necessity, and of ordinary soldiers, officers, and conscripts caught inside a machine that had stopped functioning long before its political masters were willing to admit as much. Understanding how a professional, well-drilled, technically sophisticated army disintegrated so completely in under a year says a great deal about the limits of willpower and ideology when set against the plain arithmetic of industrial war, and it is worth taking the time to understand properly, because the pattern it reveals has repeated itself in smaller ways in conflicts ever since. To understand the scale of what collapsed in early 1945, you first have to understand what Germany had already lost by the time that collapse began, because the final disintegration of the Wehrmacht was less an event than the last stage of an exhaustion that had been building since the summer of 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union had cost Germany manpower on a scale that no European nation had absorbed before in modern warfare. By the end of 1941 alone, German losses on the Eastern Front, killed, wounded, and missing combined, ran into the hundreds of thousands, a figure that continued climbing with grim regularity through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through the long grinding retreat that followed. Estimates place total German military dead across the war at somewhere between 4 and 5 million men, and the overwhelming majority of that toll, roughly 3/4 by most calculations, was suffered on the Eastern Front. This was not a war Germany's population could sustain indefinitely, however total the mobilization, and by 1944 the strain on the German replacement system had become impossible to disguise even from the men running it. The demographic maths were unforgiving. Germany's pre-war population was smaller than that of the Soviet Union by a wide margin, and unlike the Soviet Union, Germany could not simply absorb the losses through sheer weight of numbers drawn from a vast rural hinterland. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was conscripting boys as young as 16 and men well past 50, a measure that would have been unthinkable in 1939, and even this expanded pool of eligible manpower could not keep pace with losses that, by some months of 1944, exceeded 200,000 men. Divisions that had once mustered close to 15,000 soldiers at full strength were, by the last winter of the war, frequently fielding fewer than 5,000.
Their paper strength on organizational charts bearing almost no relationship to the number of men who could actually be found and armed on any given day. German staff officers had a term for this gap between notional and actual strength, and by 1945, the gap had become the rule rather than the exception across nearly the entire army. Compounding the manpower crisis was the destruction of the industrial base that had once made the Wehrmacht the most mechanized and best supplied fighting force in Europe. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, particularly once it began systematically targeting German oil production and the railway network from the spring of 1944 onward, achieved something that years of ground combat alone had not. It began to starve the German war machine of the fuel and transport capacity it needed simply to move. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, which by 1944 supplied the majority of the aviation and vehicle fuel the country still had access to, were reduced to a fraction of their earlier output within months of the bombing campaign's intensification. Entire panzer divisions, formations that on paper still represented a formidable armored force, found themselves unable to move their tanks more than a few kilometers for want of petrol, their crews reduced to defending fixed positions with vehicles that had become, in effect, static pillboxes, rather than the fast-moving instruments of maneuver warfare the German army had built its early reputation upon. The railway network, meanwhile, essential not just for moving troops and equipment, but for keeping the entire war economy functioning, was being cut apart, junction by junction, bridge by bridge, in a campaign that German transport officials increasingly described in near-despairing terms in their internal reports. By early 1945, moving a single division from one sector of the front to another, a task that in 1940 might have taken a few days, could take weeks if it could be accomplished at all. The officer corps suffered its own particular crisis, one that rarely receives the same attention as the rank-and-file losses, but which mattered enormously to an army that had always prided itself on the quality and independence of its junior leadership. Junior officers and experienced, non-commissioned officers, the men who translated broad orders into effective action on the ground, died at a disproportionate rate throughout the war, their casualties running consistently higher as a share of their numbers than those of the ordinary soldiers they commanded, since leading from the front had always been embedded deeply in German tactical doctrine. By 1944, emergency officer courses had been shortened repeatedly to churn out replacements faster, producing lieutenants with a fraction of the training and experience their predecessors had carried into the war, men promoted rapidly, not because they had earned the trust of veteran soldiers through years of shared service, but because there was simply nobody else left to give the orders. Some historians studying German unit cohesion in the war's final year have pointed to this hollowing out of experienced junior leadership as being nearly as damaging to combat effectiveness as the raw numerical shortage of soldiers itself, since an army's ability to function under pressure depends enormously on trust between men and the officers leading them, a trust that could not be manufactured overnight, regardless of how urgently it was needed. Faced with a manpower shortage that conscription alone could no longer solve, and an industrial base that could no longer supply the army it already had, the German High Command turned, through the autumn and winter of 1944, to a series of increasingly desperate improvisations, and it is worth examining these in some detail, because they reveal just how far the gap had opened between what the regime was demanding of its soldiers and what it could actually provide them with. The most visible of these improvisations was the Volkssturm, formally established by decree in September 1944, and placed, tellingly, under the control of the Nazi Party rather than the regular army high command, a decision that reflected both ideological priorities and the fading confidence Hitler placed in his professional officer corps. The Volkssturm conscripted every German male between 16 and 60 not already serving elsewhere, regardless of health, training, or aptitude, into a home defense militia that was, by any conventional military standard, barely an army at all. The reality of Volkssturm equipment tells its own story. Rifles issued to these units came from wherever regional armories could find them, often weapons captured years earlier from half a dozen different national arsenals across occupied Europe. Italian carbines sitting alongside Soviet rifles and French equipment left over from 1940.
Each requiring different ammunition that local supply depots frequently could not provide in useful quantities. Some Volkssturm battalions were issued a version of a simplified rifle produced specifically for the program, crudely manufactured to save on materials and machining time, alongside vast numbers of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, cheap, disposable, and requiring almost no training to operate, which became in effect the signature weapon of Germany's final defensive improvisation, precisely because it demanded so little of the untrained men who carried it. Training for Volkssturm conscripts, where it existed at all, might amount to a single afternoon of instruction, sometimes delivered by a wounded veteran home on convalescent leave, sometimes by a local party official with no military background whatsoever. Uniforms were frequently nothing more than a Volkssturm armband worn over civilian clothes, a detail that would have serious consequences for the men wearing them once they were captured, since it left their status under the laws of war genuinely ambiguous in the eyes of many Allied soldiers on the receiving end. Alongside the Volkssturm, the regular army absorbed a stream of personnel transferred from services that had, by 1944 and 1945, lost most of their original operational purpose. Luftwaffe ground crew, increasingly redundant as German aircraft production and fuel supplies collapsed, were retrained, often hastily and inadequately, as infantry. Kriegsmarine sailors from a surface fleet that had been effectively neutralized found themselves fighting on land as improvised infantry battalions. Hitler Youth members, some as young as 14, despite official policy setting the floor at 16, were folded into combat formations that would once have refused to accept them, their fanaticism sometimes noted by Allied soldiers as genuinely more intense than that of exhausted regular troops, precisely because they had been raised on nothing but Nazi ideology and had none of the older soldiers' hard-won skepticism about the war's prospects. Alongside these improvisations and personnel ran an equally desperate effort to sustain morale and enforce compliance through fear, since Berlin understood, at some level, that the men being pressed into service had little genuine enthusiasm left for a war they increasingly recognized as lost. Flying courts-martial, mobile tribunals empowered to try and execute soldiers accused of desertion or defeatism within hours rather than weeks, operated with growing frequency through the war's final winter, and military police units, the Feldgendarmerie, were tasked increasingly not with directing traffic or policing discipline in the traditional sense, but with rounding up stragglers and deserters along the roads leading away from the front, sometimes hanging them from roadside trees with placards around their necks as a warning to others passing by. Propaganda ministries, meanwhile, promoted the idea of a national redoubt, a supposed fortified stronghold in the Alps where elite formations would retreat to continue the fight indefinitely, a scheme that so alarmed Allied planners that it shaped elements of their own strategic thinking in the war's final weeks, despite the fact that post-war investigation found remarkably little concrete preparation had actually gone into building any such thing. The gap between the propaganda Germany's soldiers were fed and the physical reality they could see with their own eyes, empty fuel depots, unbuilt fortifications, Promises of miracle weapons that never materialized in any numbers that mattered widened by the month. And it is this widening gap, as much as any single battlefield defeat, that historians point to when explaining why compliance, by the war's final weeks, increasingly depended on fear of the flying courts-martial rather than on any remaining belief in eventual victory. None of this constituted a coherent solution to Germany's manpower crisis. It was, rather, a series of increasingly frantic attempts to paper over a gap that had become structurally unbridgeable, dressing civilians, sailors, airmen, and children in whatever uniforms and however many weapons could be found, and calling the result an army because the alternative was admitting that no real army remained to be called. Layered over this manpower and material crisis was a command culture, radiating from Hitler himself, that made the underlying collapse dramatically worse than it needed to be. Hitler's insistence on holding ground rather than permitting the kind of orderly, elastic withdrawals that his own generals repeatedly recommended turned tactical setbacks into strategic catastrophes with numbing regularity. Time and again through the last year of the war, commanders who could see with total clarity that a position was untenable, that a withdrawal to a shorter, more defensible line was the only sensible course, it were forbidden from retreating and ordered instead to hold to the last man. The results were entirely predictable to the officers on the ground and entirely unwelcome to the man giving the orders from Berlin. Formations that might have escaped encirclement to fight another day, on more favorable terms, further back, found themselves instead cut off, surrounded, and eventually destroyed or captured wholesale, their fuel exhausted, their ammunition dwindling, their supply lines severed by an Allied air force that could strike almost anything moving in daylight across most of the front by early 1945. This dynamic played out with tragic consistency at Falaise in Normandy the previous summer, along the Rhine in the early months of 1945, and finally in the vast pocket that formed around the Ruhr industrial region in April, where an entire army group under Field Marshal Walter Model was encircled and eventually dissolved rather than formally surrendered, a distinction Model himself insisted upon even as more than 300,000 of his own soldiers gave themselves up around him. Hitler's fortress orders, designating cities and towns as strongpoints to be held regardless of their actual defensibility, tied down German garrisons in positions that often served no coherent strategic purpose beyond the political symbolism of denying the enemy a headline, while the wider front around them simply collapsed and moved past. Dwight Eisenhower himself later observed, with something close to professional bemusement, that the German dictator's refusal to permit a fluid withdrawal east of the Rhine had effectively delivered hundreds of thousands of prisoners into Allied hands on a plate, men who might otherwise have escaped west to east to continue the fight, or at least to negotiate surrender on marginally better terms. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, launched barely a month before the Vistula front collapsed, illustrates how badly this pattern of improvisation and inflexible command had already damaged German fighting capacity even before the final winter's disasters began in earnest. Hitler had insisted on the operation against the near-unanimous advice of his senior generals, gambling a substantial portion of Germany's remaining fuel reserves and its last genuinely capable armored reserves on a plan to split the Western Allies and seize the port of Antwerp, a target that, given the fuel shortages already constraining German operations elsewhere, was almost certainly beyond reach from the outset. The offensive achieved initial surprise and drove a dramatic bulge into American lines, but stalled within days once its leading panzer units, exactly as German logistics officers had privately feared, simply ran out of petrol. Some crews reduced to capturing American fuel dumps in the hope of continuing their advance, a hope that was disappointed often enough to strand entire columns of otherwise serviceable tanks by the roadside. The manpower and equipment expended in the Ardennes, including a substantial share of what remained of Germany's trained panzer crews and mobile reserves, could not be replaced, and its loss left the Rhine and the approaches to central Germany defended, in the weeks that followed by formations even more threadbare than they might otherwise have been. A similar pattern played out in Hungary in early 1945, where Hitler diverted some of the last significant panzer reserves available to the Wehrmacht into an offensive around Lake Balaton aimed at protecting the oil fields at Nagy Kanica, among the last significant sources of natural petroleum still under German control. The operation, launched in March 1945, consumed fuel and armor that many of Hitler's own generals argued would have been better used defending the approaches to Berlin itself, and it failed within roughly 10 days. Its remaining tanks withdrawn in a retreat so hurried and disorganized that German accounts from the period describe formations abandoning still serviceable vehicles for lack of fuel to move them even a further few kilometers. Taken together, the Ardennes and Balaton offensives illustrate a pattern that recurs throughout Germany's final year. A high command willing to gamble its last significant mobile reserves on operations whose objectives, on any sober assessment of the available fuel and manpower, were plainly unreachable, and each such gamble left the wider front measurably weaker once it inevitably failed. If you are enjoying this one, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might expect, and it costs nothing but a moment of your time. There's a good deal more still to come in exactly how this collapse played out on the ground in the war's final weeks, and in how it compares with what other nations facing similar manpower crises actually did. So, if this kind of detailed military history is your sort of thing, it is well worth sticking around for the rest. The pace of disintegration through the war's final months is, once the figures are set out plainly, almost difficult to credit. The Vistula-Oder offensive that opened in January 1945 saw Soviet forces advance an average of roughly 20 miles a day across some sectors, a rate of movement that recalled the German blitzkrieg tactics of 1940, rather than anything the Wehrmacht itself could any longer muster in response. German formations attempting to conduct a fighting withdrawal frequently found themselves overtaken by faster-moving Soviet armored spearheads before they could establish a new defensive line, turning what should have been an orderly retreat into a series of running collapses with entire columns of vehicles, many already crippled by fuel shortages, abandoned by roadsides across Poland and Silesia as their crews attempted to escape on foot. The collapse in the east was compounded by the sheer breadth of the front German forces were now expected to hold with formations already stretched past breaking point. Army Group Center, which had once been among the most formidable concentrations of German fighting power anywhere in Europe, found itself by January 1945 attempting to cover a front far too wide for its remaining divisions to defend in any depth, gaps opening between neighboring units that Soviet reconnaissance identified and exploited within days, sometimes within hours, of their appearance. German staff officers, reviewing situation maps that had once shown continuous, mutually supporting defensive lines, increasingly found themselves marking isolated pockets of resistance, separated by tens of kilometers of largely undefended ground, a cartographic representation of an army that existed, by this stage, more as a scattering of increasingly desperate strongpoints than as a coherent, connected front in any traditional sense. In the West, the pattern differed in its particulars but arrived at broadly the same destination. Through March and into April 1945, the rate of German soldiers surrendering to American and British forces climbed with a speed that startled even the commanders receiving them, from roughly 10,000 men a day in early March to something closer to 40,000 a day within the first fortnight of April, and beyond 50,000 a day in the campaign's final 10 days as the Ruhr pocket finished collapsing entirely. This was not, by that stage, principally a story of soldiers being defeated in battle. It was increasingly a story of formations simply running out of the fuel, ammunition, food, and functioning command structure needed to continue existing as a fighting force at all, their soldiers making an entirely rational individual calculation that continuing to hold a position that had already, in every practical sense, ceased to be defensible served no purpose beyond adding to the death toll. The collapse of German logistics deserves particular attention here, because it is easy to focus on the dramatic images of mass surrender and overlook the grinding, unglamorous breakdown of supply that made those surrenders close to inevitable. By early 1945, German fuel production had fallen to a fraction of what the war economy required simply to keep existing formations mobile, let alone to support offensive operations. Ammunition production, though it held up somewhat better than fuel through most of 1944 owing to Albert Speer's determined efforts to rationalize war industry, began to suffer its own severe disruptions once Allied bombing succeeded in fragmenting the rail network that moved shells and cartridges from factories to the front. Food supply for frontline units deteriorated correspondingly, with soldiers in the final months of the war frequently reporting rations that fell well short of even the reduced allocation set earlier in the conflict, malnutrition compounding exhaustion in units that were already operating at a fraction of their notional strength. Communications, too, collapsed in ways that made coherent command increasingly impossible, even where units retained the will and the means to keep fighting. Telephone lines, cut repeatedly by artillery and by advancing Allied forces, forced growing reliance on radio, itself vulnerable to jamming and to the simple physical destruction of transmitters and generators. Divisional and Corps headquarters increasingly found themselves issuing orders based on situation reports that were hours or even days out of date by the time they reached the units meant to act on them. A lag that, against opponents capable of moving 30 or 40 kilometers in a single day, rendered much of the German High Command's operational picture essentially fictional by the war's final weeks. Field Marshal Model's decision in April 1945 to dissolve his own Army Group B rather than issue a formal surrender was itself an acknowledgment of exactly this reality, that the command structure beneath him had already ceased to function as anything resembling an army, and that continuing to issue orders into that vacuum served no purpose beyond prolonging a fiction. The human cost of this logistical breakdown fell disproportionately on the ordinary soldiers caught inside it, men who found themselves increasingly abandoned by a system that had once, at least in theory, guaranteed them regular supply, medical evacuation, and a functioning chain of command. Wounded soldiers in the war's final weeks frequently went without adequate medical care not through any deliberate policy but simply because ambulances lacked the fuel to move them, and field hospitals lacked the medicine to treat them. A far cry from the relatively well-organized medical evacuation system the German army had maintained through the war's earlier years. Soldiers separated from their units by the speed of enemy advances, or by the simple collapse of communications that left them uncertain where their own lines even lay, wandered increasingly through a landscape where the distinction between front and rear had become almost meaningless, since Allied forces, particularly in the war's final weeks, were frequently advancing faster than German rear area units could reorganize to meet them. It is this lived experience of abandonment, as much as any battlefield defeat, that surviving veterans' accounts return to again and again when describing the war's final months, a sense that the Army itself, as an institution capable of looking after its own soldiers, had simply ceased to exist some time before the fighting formally ended. Setting the German collapse against how other combatant nations handled comparable manpower crises throws the scale of the disintegration into sharper relief. The Soviet Union, despite absorbing catastrophic losses of its own throughout the war, running to a total military death toll usually estimated at somewhere between 8 and 11 million, maintained a functioning, if brutally administered, replacement and mobilization system through to the war's end, drawing on a far larger population base and a state apparatus that, whatever its other failings, proved remarkably effective at converting raw manpower into functioning combat divisions even under extreme pressure. The United States and Britain, facing nothing like the same demographic strain, nonetheless developed sophisticated replacement depot systems, specifically designed to ensure that individual soldiers lost to casualties were replaced by men who had received adequate training before reaching the front line, a system that, whatever its bureaucratic frustrations for the men caught inside it, avoided the German pattern of throwing barely trained conscripts directly into combat formations that had no capacity left to absorb and integrate them properly. Germany's own attempt at a comparable solution, the Volkssturm and its associated improvisations, differed from all of these not merely in scale, but in basic design. Where Soviet, American, and British replacement systems were built, however imperfectly, around the principle of getting reasonably trained soldiers to units that could use them effectively, the German system, by late 1944, had essentially abandoned that principle altogether, prioritizing the raw appearance of continued resistance over any genuine assessment of whether the men being mobilized could fight, or indeed survive, in any meaningful sense. This was not lost on German officers themselves, many of whom recorded, in post-war memoirs and in the small number of wartime diaries that survive, a bleak, private recognition that units built this way existed chiefly to be sacrificed rather than to hold ground, a grim accounting that Berlin's propaganda apparatus never once acknowledged in public. The American replacement depot system, sometimes criticized at the time by the very soldiers who passed through it for its impersonal, almost industrial approach to plugging gaps in frontline units, nonetheless ensured that a man arriving at the front had typically received a standardized course of training before he was expected to fight, and that officers receiving him could expect a broadly consistent baseline of preparation across the replacements sent to them, whatever their individual variation in aptitude or courage. British reinforcement drafts operated on broadly similar principles, channeling replacements through holding units where basic skills could be assessed and, where necessary, reinforced before men were sent forward. The Soviet system, though far harsher in its treatment of individual soldiers and considerably less concerned with minimizing casualties among newly mobilized men, nonetheless drew on a mobilization apparatus that had been refined across years of total war on a scale the Eastern Front demanded, one capable of raising, equipping, and, to a reasonable extent, training new formations even as older ones were being fed into the meat grinder of the front line. None of the major combatants facing manpower strain in the war's final years resorted to anything resembling the Volkssturm's near-total abandonment of training and equipment standards, a fact that reflects less on the moral character of the nations involved than on how much further along the road to systemic collapse Germany had traveled by comparison. The impact and legacy of this collapse reached considerably further than the immediate battlefield arithmetic of early 1945. Militarily, the speed and completeness of the disintegration meant that by the time Germany surrendered formally in May, the Western Allies alone were holding well over 3 million German prisoners of war in the Northwest European theater, a logistical burden so far beyond anything Allied planners had budgeted for that improvised holding camps had to be constructed at speed simply to contain the numbers involved. Historically, the manner of the collapse, achieved through a combination of manpower exhaustion, industrial destruction, and command dysfunction, rather than through any single decisive battlefield defeat, has become a central case study for military historians examining how modern industrial states fail under sustained total war, cited repeatedly in post-war analyses of everything from strategic bombing's actual effectiveness to the risks of centralized, ideologically driven military command overriding professional judgment in the field. Some of the debate here remains genuinely contested. Historians continue to argue over the precise weighting to give strategic bombing's contribution to the fuel and transport crisis versus the raw manpower exhaustion inflicted by years of Eastern Front attrition, and the surviving German wartime records, incomplete and in places deliberately falsified even at the time, make definitive statistical certainty on several of these questions genuinely difficult to achieve. What can be said with confidence, because it rests on Allied intelligence assessments compiled at the time, on post-war interrogations of surviving German officers, and on the German Army's own increasingly desperate internal correspondence through the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945, is the broad shape of what happened. An army that had once been the most feared fighting force in Europe found itself, within the space of roughly a year, transformed into a patchwork of exhausted veterans, untrained boys, redundant sailors and airmen, and elderly civilians in armbands, held together less by functioning logistics or coherent command than by fear, propaganda, and the sheer bureaucratic momentum of a totalitarian state unwilling to admit defeat until defeat had become physically undeniable. Surviving Volkssturm rifles and Panzerfausts, along with the administrative decrees establishing the program itself, are held today in military history archives and museum collections across Germany and beyond, tangible remnants of an improvisation born from genuine desperation rather than from any coherent military doctrine, and the German Historical Museum in Berlin, among other institutions, displays examples of the makeshift weapons and armbands issued to these final conscripts alongside the original mobilization orders that summoned them into service. Post-war historians examining this collapse have devoted particular attention to disentangling how much weight to place on each contributing cause, and the debate has never fully settled. Some, following the influential post-war work of United States strategic bombing survey analysts, have emphasized the fuel and transport crisis as the single most decisive factor, arguing that no degree of manpower resilience could have compensated for an army that had lost the physical ability to move. Others, examining the German Army's own internal correspondence and the testimony of surviving officers gathered in post-war interviews, have placed greater weight on the sheer exhaustion of trained manpower accumulated since 1941, arguing that the fuel crisis, however severe, compounded a collapse that was already well underway for entirely separate reasons rooted in years of Eastern Front attrition. Still others point to Hitler's centralized, inflexible command style as the decisive multiplier, the factor that turned a difficult but potentially manageable strategic retreat into a series of catastrophic encirclements that shed hundreds of thousands of prisoners in a matter of weeks. The honest answer, and the one most careful historians now tend to favor,